That's a good question.
So I think we're good to start in three minutes, I think. I'm sorry for the delay, by the way, at the beginning.
We're still 2 minutes ahead, no? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just get something to drink. I'll be back in a second.
Mm-hmm. How is the situation with you? All good? Locked in, locked out?
Locked out. Well, not locked out, but
No,
free to
knocked
leave.
out.
Not knocked out anymore either. I had a bit of an insane weekend, but now it's all calmed down again. What about you?
We just had to postpone the winter school that we were planning for January, because we have this quarantine regulation.
Oh.
Actually, I remember now the very funny, but of course I remember the winter school with Tassos. So now, sometimes a bit slow. So now I remember you, of course. So now this time, well, it will not work out. So we have either to do it online as well or to postpone for 1 year. Which we already did last year, so that's a pity. Otherwise, yeah, I'm going to classroom here, so that's working well.
That's nice. How do we know when we're being streamed?
Oh,
Already.
Okay.
I'm also talking to someone in the room, so.
Okay, so we are being streamed already.
We are already waiting.
Well, be careful what
you
we say. Yeah.
What did we say? No, it was okay.
Just something about the winter school.
Yeah, so I think it was correct. So.
Yeah.
Since we all know how to cut and edit these videos by now, we can also cut that part out.
That is true, yeah.
With which program are you taking, Karen, for cutting it? Okay.
That's my husband. He's doing it.
That's not the program, that's the husband. But because I do it myself and I have an old movie maker or something, it's a bit slow, but it works.
Yeah, on our university platform, you can do it, but it's very rough. And so if you want to have a little bit more control, then.
Okay. I think now we're good to go.
Okay, so I'll start.
Right now, I've admitted everyone in the meeting, so you can start.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Pia Andres. I have the pleasure of chairing this panel today on the energy transition and how it relates to economics. So our panelists are Professor Karen Pittel, who's a professor of economics at the University of Munich in the Department of Economics. Her research focuses particularly on energy, climate, and exhaustible natural resources, and she's also the director of the IFO Center for Energy, Climate, and Resources. And Professor Lukas Brečka is a professor of economics and resource economics at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich in the Department of Management, Technology, and Economics. So we're very lucky to have them here today to tell us about the energy transition. And the way that we're going to do this is that I will ask some introductory questions, and then we're going to open the floor to questions from the audience. So you can ask our panelists, whatever, any question that you have about the energy transition or anything related to it. So welcome. And my first question is if you could just sort of answer in general, what in your view does the energy transition entail, and what do you think that economists can contribute to it? Why are economists important in this debate? Karen, do you want to start?
I was just showing Lucas to start, but
whoever. So what now? Me or you?
You.
Okay, no, thank you. So thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me to this panel. I'm glad to start, and I'm sure that Karen can complement whatever I forgot to say. Well, so many things can be said. So energy transition basically is about the decarbonization of the economy, right? We have to get rid of fossil fuel, coal, gas, and oil. And of course, this is major. This is a thorough transformation of the whole economy, not just of the energy sector, because many, sectors are linked or depending on fossil fuels, on energy. And so it is a major thing. But now there are cost and benefits, and people tend to see mostly the cost and often miss to see the opportunities and the chances and the innovation which is coming out of this process. So I believe we should, as economists, stress that already now technologies are moving very fast. So I think we are living in a revolution when we look at the energy sector. For example, if you look at the cost, these costs have dropped dramatically already since 2010. I think the cost for solar PV have dropped 80%. But for onshore wind, 45%, and by an insane 90% for lithium-ion batteries. So this is moving very fast. And what is remarkable in this development is that people have underestimated, misperceived the development constantly. And this will probably go on for the next future because the prices are expected to fall again. And I think the 2020s will be one of the most disruptive decades in energy history. So we as economists should take care of this development. We should actually provide a careful analysis of this dynamics, of the economic dynamics in general. And we should explain what happens and why it happens. And this is what we call positive analysis. So this is what just to give a careful picture of what actually is observed on the world level. And then for the normative analysis, this is what actually should be done, what we believe should be implemented. There we have to highlight that energy policy and environmental policy is badly needed. No major environmental problem has been solved without a policy. So we have to say, well, already now we see the first electric cars, for example, were built in California to comply with the Clean Air Act. We have seen in Norway how the policy has helped to accelerate the transition to electric mobility. So all these things have an important impact. Technology drives, but of course, policy is always at the origin, and it can accelerate development. That is needed because we are lagging in the whole thing. So I think the big blocks, the big powers have already confirmed. The EU has confirmed. US at the moment with the current government and China, they are all on board. And now the question is it wise to bet against these policies, to speculate that they will fail? Rather not, because we don't want to lag in technology. So we as economists have to bring this message across in a convincing manner. And on the last note, I would add we should also as economists try to be involved in policy advice and do some, be involved in different levels. I've been personally involved in the climate negotiations and also have tried to advise the government on energy and climate issues.
Thank you, Lucas. Let's hear from Karen.
I mean, Lucas already said a lot of things. I mean, one thing that kind of strikes me as interesting is usually that, this is not the first energy transition that society is going through. I mean, energy transitions is basically everything where you have a fundamental change in the energy system. So basically the rise of coal or fossil fuels, the rise of power, all those were basically energy transitions. But I think the main difference really is that this time it's not driven by economic concerns, but rather by environmental concerns or climate concerns. So that isn't to say that government policy didn't play a role in other energy transitions, but the aim, the direction is really different this time. And like Lucas said, it's not really only energy. I mean, energy and climate go hand in hand, in my head at least. And also the entire, the need for investment is going to, and the need for new technology is going to introduce so much structural change in the entire economy on a macro level, also on a micro level. So there's so much for economists also to analyze. There's innovation policies. How do you trigger the right innovation? There's also distributional concerns that are, at least in Germany at the moment, a big topic. concerning energy and also climate policy. And of course, there's also from an economics perspective, what is important is of course also the in-depth really analysis of the energy sector. I mean, Lucas has already described some stuff that we have observed in the past: rise of new technologies, riding along learning curves, technologies getting cheaper. But there's so much additionally, like how should you design, for example, support for renewables? Is a carbon price the solution for everything? How should we design grid fees? How do we actually cope with fluctuating energy? I mean, this is to some extent always an engineering issue, but also to a very large extent an economics issue, because which technologies we actually are using or are going to use depends a lot on whether these are actually competitive compared to the other types of technologies, like old types of technologies. So there's really a lot to do for theoretical analysis, for empirical analysis, but also for numerical analysis. And I think this is like one of the topics, at least, that is going to invade surely but slowly, or slowly but surely, all the other domains of economics as well, because it sets simply boundary conditions to which development path economies can take. So perhaps that's just as a little addition.
Thank you both. And I have a follow-up question to that. You have talked a lot about the energy transition and the role of policy and why economists are very important in working out what the right policy is, as well as examining the broader dynamics that are at play. And I wonder if you feel that that's something that all environmental economists would agree on, or whether other colleagues in the field maybe have a different notion of what environmental economists should do. What I'm thinking about specifically is that there's a lot of work as well on discount rates. What's the right discount rate? Trying to estimate the social cost of carbon. And, Bill Nordhaus at Yale, who recently got the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work, has done a lot on that, on trying to predict, like, how much should we even decarbonize given the trade-offs with other economic goals, maybe. Do you think, and I realize that I'm jumping right into some controversy here, do you feel that perhaps economists have contributed to providing excuses for stalling climate action by focusing on these kinds of things, or maybe trying to put numbers on something that doesn't have a number, that's ultimately a political decision? Feel free to, discuss, unmute yourselves, answer in any order you want.
I mean, that is a really interesting question, because sometime this year I gave a presentation on a climate school, an interdisciplinary one at my university, and I chose a topic like, where do economists work on, and that was actually estimating the social cost of carbon, so the damages that arise from climate change over the very long term. And these estimates range from like 10 to 20 US. I mean, if you count Trump from $1 to like 300, 400, I'm not sure in British pounds, euros. So there is a big span. And of course, it depends on the method you're actually employing. It depends on the discount rate. It depends on whether you account for uncertainty, whether you take tipping points of the climate system into account. So there's a lot of different things. And that makes it so hard actually to sell climate policy from the traditional economics point of view, that we should equalize whatever price of carbon we have to the damages, because there is such a wide range of estimates. And so in my mind, this kind of counting backwards, in the sense that I accept what physics gives me, and that there's a certain range of emissions that we can still undertake until we reach the 1.5 target, 1 or 2.0, whatever is your benchmark. And then basically try to calculate carbon budgets from there, and then try to implement those and take a carbon price that's actually succeeding in getting to these goals. I think that is, from a policy perspective, the one that is much more practical, because I don't think it's necessary excuses that environmental or climate economists come up with, because the range is so wide. But I agree with you that some of the very prominent estimates are quite low, although Bill Nordhaus, in his work on the DICE model, he's also experimenting around with different discount rates, with different goals. And so he gets to, by now, in the latest articles, to a quite wide range of carbon, of social cost of carbon. But I also think that this is not everything that matters with respect to climate economics. I mean, it is an important, it's an interesting part, but like Bill Nordhaus' work on climate clubs, for example, how do you actually get the climate policy into the international arena? I think this is, for example, something that is getting more and more important, especially at the moment in the European Union, where you're kind of discussing how to try to keep your competitive edge and still raise carbon prices by a lot. So there is much more to climate economics than just social cost of carbon.
Yes, I believe the picture is a bit, in the public is probably mixed, because, we have, different carbon prices, different results. But in principle, economists agree on how to tackle the problem, right? We have a methodology which is firm, which is used. But then it is true that we have, when we apply the real numbers and we implement concrete functions in our model, then we have quite a big discrepancy and we have differences. And I believe we have also the problem that we came a bit late to the party. So climate scientists were early, the physicists were early. They also disagreed probably, but then they had this convergence. I started with this quite early, and we were really late in talking to each other, and still we disagree. Of course, in science, it's the noble thing to disagree, to debate, and to come up with different models and conclusions. Also a way of, get some profile. If you have a so completely different results and people talk of you, if you just confirm what's around, this is not interesting. But for the public, we are not really good in providing coherent messages. I agree. So now what people have done, because Nordhaus is so prominent. By the way, I think we should say, first of all, we have respect for the intellectual, achievement, being a pioneer and making this model publicly available. This is really what he did. But then on the second, it's the second thing to say, well, he picked the numbers right and the functions are all right. And this is what now people also in London have tried to do, to fix basically the model, to having better damage functions, to have better abatement cost functions. And then the results, they alter quite drastically. It's not only the discount rate. For example, if you look at the abatement cost, in Nordhaus, it's getting more and more expensive. The more you abate emissions, it's getting more expensive. So, and actually this curve is very convex. It becomes more and more costly to do this abatement. While in the reality, I believe it's quite the opposite. Because if you change the system from fossil-driven mobility to electric mobility, it's difficult to start. In the beginning, you don't have the network, you don't have any support. Then the first cars are most expensive. And if you have 99% already changed of the whole system, the last percent is very cheap. So we have to fix these functions. We have to improve on our modeling. And then I think we can also convey the message as in basically it's becoming quite cheap to do the energy transition. But there we are, for the public, I agree, it's a bit difficult to bring out this message. But many researchers have now said, okay, let's take the basic methodology, the basic DICE model, but fix it in the sense that it gets better numbers or more accurate numbers. And then, of course, also for the public, it becomes interesting to see what we have. So I think we have just to have a further round of convergence among economists, but the basic things, basic messages are not too different. And also when you talk about carbon pricing, but we can probably extend this, we also have, of course, a common agreement that this would be actually a very good instrument to do climate policy.
Yeah, thank you, Lucas. I think you got at something very important here, which is what is really the cost of transitioning, right? And something which I personally always find is that as economists, sometimes we're kind of stuck in that framework of thinking of, oh, the margin. And then we just assume that costs are increasing at the margin in most cases. But actually what we're dealing here is a transition. And the cost is the cost of transitioning and breaking out of an old system and creating a whole new system. So what do you feel are kind of the blind spots in economics? How can we redesign our methodologies to address these problems in a more adequate way? And why won't the carbon price alone solve other problems? Or do you feel that a carbon price alone maybe is enough to achieve what we need to achieve? Why not?
Can I start? Or, okay.
Yeah.
Because Karin is muted, I will continue. So, I mean, we have to, we have to extend the models in many respects. Now, several things I've already said. Another dimension which is missing in many models is risk and uncertainty. We have to admit that there is a risk. There's a huge uncertainty about the future, and we have methods, we have models to implement this, but we have to include this in a rational manner. Uncertainty should not be guiding us to say we don't do anything because we don't know anything. Yes, we know that we are uncertain, but we can implement this in today's decision making. Now about carbon pricing, this is interesting because basically the economists agree this would be the best measure. We should reflect the true cost of using carbon in our pricing. This would provide the right incentives and would avoid free riding. But now when you come to the implementation, there is lots of resistance. I mean, we had in Switzerland a referendum on carbon policies was rejected also because people don't like taxes. So we better call it pricing rather than taxes, but still people, they know that they got to pay. And one of the main concerns, and I think Karin already rightly mentioned this, is equity and fairness. People think it's unfair for the poor, it's unfair for lower middle classes. So one has really to make sure that people get it, that it's not an unfair measure. One can, for example, give the tax returns fully back to the public. One can distribute it on a per capita term. And maybe it's even better to give the dividend first than to cash in later. So you can send a check out first to the households that they have a positive feeling, and then you later on you cash in by a bit higher price on carbon. So that could be a way to say, look, it's really about equity and fairness. We care about these things. But for example, what France did, that was really a bad example. First to decrease or remove the wealth tax, and then to have a carbon tax which the proceeds or entirely go to the government. So people, of course, they feel that this is really not equitable. But then one other thing which is amazing, I mean, the carbon tax really works, and this is a problem. People know that this works, so they constantly badmouth the carbon tax and say, well, you know, they have any talk about, well, inelastic demand, but actually we know from empirics it works. We have a study on UK and on the fuel tax which really shows it works. We have other studies which really show so. If you propose something which is really biting, then people are kind of opposing, because in theory, we have the polluter pays principle, but this is a principle. So this would be say, okay, if you're polluting, you pay the carbon tax, and then this is more or less okay. But then polluters are also voters, and the voters, they say secretly no. I mean, they know that they're doing bad, but you know, we have polluter pays principle. But what I call is the polluter resist paying fact. So if they should pay, they say, well, why should I? I don't want to, and they try to free ride everywhere. So the tax. The tax instrument is biting, but this is why it's not liked by many. And then we have to complement it probably by subsidies for new technologies. We have to also introduce bans if they work. If people think the ban of the ICE car, for example, in cities or countries, this is something they would approve. And then why not doing that? Because in the end, should we rather convince people about believing in true economics, or should we believe them that they follow us in doing real climate policy? I rather go for the latter. Of course, I would hope for the first as well. But if it's about implementing true measures which are really working, then we should probably consider a mix of instruments.
Okay, can you hear me still? Because I had to get the cable. Okay, two parts of the question. The first one with respect to the modeling part. I agree with Lucas. We do not take account of uncertainty enough, risk enough. And one aspect actually that is really important also in designing policies with respect to carbon prices, for example, is regulatory risk, which you do not usually take account of. But first, coming back to the modeling challenges. I think there's also other things, like Pia already said, we're always thinking at the margin. We are not really thinking a lot about disruptive change, about sectors that basically have to fundamentally change the way they work, the way they produce in a very short time span. I don't think we're really good at modeling that so far. We're also not, in my mind, paying enough attention to not only the supply side, but also the demand side. What makes people, what changes their preferences? How do preferences change in a way that something is considered to be bad in the beginning and then either normal or even good in the end? So this preference development, which is necessary for people also to change their behavior, I don't think we understand very well. And a third thing that I'm always kind of stumbling across is the fact that economists kind of try to model, which is basically also due to our modeling approaches, one problem at a time. So there's a lot of different things that actually should worry us at the moment. It's not only climate change, it's also, for example, land use issues, it's biodiversity, and in some instances you can actually design policies that one problem gets better, the others get worse, or you can try to actually use the synergies that you have. And we're not really good at that. So considering also, for example, impacts of climate change on biodiversity and what you should do to actually protect biodiversity could have significant consequences also for climate policy. I think we're not good in considering that stuff. And with respect to carbon prices, I mean, if the world was as nice as our models in the sense that we have perfect foresight, we know everything, there's no other market failures, then carbon prices would be fine. But like Luca said, at the moment we have the problem that we basically agree that we have to be we should be carbon neutral at around the half of the century, so 250, a little earlier or a little later. And we cannot raise carbon prices in a way that they would induce the change that we need fast. For example, in Germany, we have at the moment, we have still quite a big industrial sector, and some of the branches there, they have up to reinvestment needs up to 60% in the next decade. If they, for example, steel plants go for an old technology, which then runs 30 to 40 years, we're way beyond the 250 or 245 as our goal is. So we have to introduce these policies, these new technologies really fast. We don't have the carbon prices that trigger that. So we do need extra policies, basically in this phase of transition, in order to get things into the market, to actually get firms to invest, although they are the first ones and are still paying a high price because learning has not taken place yet. Then there's the general notion of myopia, also when households decide what to do, for example, with respect to driving, with respect to housing, with respect to renovations. All these kind of issues and the regulatory uncertainty that firms are basically not sure. Might the policymaker change his mind? Might he perhaps subsidize in the future and just price calm now? All these kind of issues make a carbon price less effective. It's still very necessary. I think it should be the absolute baseline for each carbon policy, but then you need investment in infrastructure, which takes too long otherwise. You need support of innovations, basically getting into the market. You have to support sometimes even the development of new markets altogether, demand and supply. So there's a lot of instances where we have to support the carbon price, but we should do it intelligently. We should focus on infrastructure. We should focus on supporting certain technologies, for example, for a while. And we kind of tend to, once we start subsidizing, we tend to keep it forever. And I think that's a big problem. So we have to have an intelligent mix, but the carbon price alone is not enough. And I think most economists actually by now agree on that.
Thank you, Karen. I think you've kind of touched on a lot of what the first question from the audience that we received gets at, but I'm going to read it out anyway. Obviously, I have many more questions, but since we already have some questions from the audience, I think let's move on to them. So the first question is, in her speech today at the symposium, Professor Laura Diaz-Anadon has mentioned that competitiveness in the technology sector co-benefits decarbonization and innovation. what are your views on this matter? Do you think there's enough regulation, especially in the US and EU, to support competitiveness in the technology sector? I think there are kind of two elements here, and I'm not sure which one it tries to get at, but I guess the main one would be the Porter hypothesis, and the other one would be clean technology itself. So what are your views on this? Lucas, do you want to start, since Karen has just told us a lot about technology and investment?
Sure, I can. I mean, in principle, I fully agree. I think there are strong co-benefits, and I hope to start with a message that actually climate policy shapes the technology race. And if you're lagging, then you're not only losing the environmental game, you're also losing technology game. And I think those who are really leaders, they can profit a lot. They have good business, they have employment. And those who are too long in the fossil world, they will lose in the long run. But now these incumbents, those who are still on the markets, they try to delay, they try to badmouth, they try to divert governments from giving enough support for new technologies. And as a matter of fact, we are still subsidizing fossil fuels heavily, which is a huge mistake. But it's not only in oil countries, it's also in many countries. Through different channels, oil and coal is still subsidized, which is really exactly the wrong signal that we are giving. So I would say removing those subsidies and giving more promotion to the new technologies, that would be absolutely a key of the game. And then the question, of course, is which now of these new technologies will win the race. There are several candidates, and we are kind of having a different view on what will be the best technology in 20 years from now. We could say we have a general subsidy support scheme, and then let the market pick the best ones. But if only the government is supporting something which is really huge, then we should be suspicious and not give too much money there. I think it's a combination of incentives from public money and then private companies picking the things up and then really going to the market and implement things. They might fail, but they might also be successful. And again, with the example of electric mobility, companies have been successful. So this could be the model for the future. So and then also we have to observe the basic laws of physics. Of course, we cannot give hydrogen too much of an importance, because there is simply a too high loss in producing the thing. But it could still be playing a role in the future. So to have a public incentive scheme for R&D is key, but then also give the market a role to pick the good technologies and pick the good future avenues, so that we have a mix of both. I think this is my reaction on this.
Yep. I mean, the one thing I think sometimes is perhaps underestimated is that supporting innovation in green technologies is not only done by subsidies, but is really also done by carbon pricing. I'm not to just mention that too often, but in the end, if you make the other technologies not competitive anymore, you have an advantage in the other fields. So I think this is also, in a way, it is a support for green technologies. And like Lucas said, I mean, sometimes what I think is not a good idea in supporting green technologies is focusing on one technology too early, because then you're losing potentially a lot of opportunities. That said, at some point you have to take a decision. And that is kind of like the boundaries of technological openness, if you want. Because if you just think, for example, I mean, that's always my example of trucking in Europe. If you have trucking in Europe, and in one country trucks are supposed to use hydrogen, and the next one they're supposed to use like overhead lines or whatever, that won't work in the long time. So you have to kind of take a decision, especially if there's a lot of infrastructure that is needed. So that's not in all fields, but in some fields. And like I said, support is important, but like Lucas also stressed, it can't be the business model for all time. So there has to be a consideration, like, is this, how long do we actually have to support a certain technology, and in which way do we do it best? Because also public households cannot support or pay for the entire energy transition. I mean, I think in Germany, like 90% of investment comes from the private sector. So we have to find actually models where public action, like with respect to risk taking, with respect to shared financing, public-private partnership, whatever, leads to also incentives to actually invest privately. And then, like Lucas said, where the risk is and where the revenues are, that's much better accessible by private companies in many cases than by the government.
Thank you. Next question from the room. How will the trends regarding global energy demand change as we move towards a low carbon future? And I think this also touches on the current energy crisis, possibly. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, the best thing that can happen to climate policy is the spike in fossil fuel prices that we observe at the moment. I mean, it's not a laughing matter. I mean, there's households that actually really struggle with for example, rising gas prices. But I think this volatility and also the rise in the prices actually, at least in my country, gave much more support to we should get more independent from these fossil imports and concentrate more on the one hand, solar and wind at home. I mean, nuclear is not really in the picture in Germany, but also with respect to what Lucas also touched upon, hydrogen for flights, for trucking, for example, for industrial purposes, not for individual transport. I don't believe in that either. Also points to the fact that you should diversify actually your sources quite considerably, because at least to some extent, our problems with respect to gas supply and gas prices also stem from the fact that we rely on very few suppliers. And so basically having a more diverse set of suppliers, having more diverse set of sources, I think that will really help. So the international trade in energy will basically completely, I hope, completely run down the fossil trade, so coal, gas, oil, and will be substituted by hydrogen and synthetic fuels.
Yeah, we are going more and more into electricity, and electricity is more efficient than fossil fuels. So the efficiency of the engines, of everything is much higher. So in general, we could use a bit less because we're getting more efficient. But then I have to teach a little bit what I usually say to students. I don't know how many economists are in the audience, but if you think about energy demand, engineers tend to think that this is a point somewhere. So this is X terawatt hours of demand, and economists would say no, demand is a function, and a basic determinant of this function is the price. So demand can be high or low depending on how the prices. So Karen talked about the high oil prices at the moment, the high gas prices, and then also the demand depends on income, on the structure of the technologies which are used. So actually, we rather should talk about energy use, not energy demand, because people think this is a fixed amount. No, it's not. We can have an impact on this amount which is used on markets. And then also, even if you read some international reports from the International Energy Agency, I don't know if they're stopped now. So they had some development over time where there was one curve labeled, so energy over time, one was labeled demand and it was supply. So there was a big gap or an increasing gap between the two. For the economists, this is strange because on a market, you usually don't have gaps because if you have one, then you have the price, which is adjusted. So this is basic microeconomics 101. So we should not talk about these energy gaps, but we should talk about the prices. We should talk maybe about blackouts. But even that, I mean, this is a different matter. But in the long run, if say the supply is very short, then the prices will rise. And if you're not getting more efficient, then of course we will have the problem of high prices. But I would say rather talk about energy use, and there I see some potential for savings, because electricity is more efficient than fossil fuels. The cars are much more efficient and the heatings are much more efficient. So there's much lost if you burn fossil fuels. I mean, it's really basically a crime to do this piece of art from nature, to burn this just for getting a bit warm and to move a car. But on top of that, we will have a growing world economy. We have a growing world population. So we have to think about efficiency. And with electricity, we can be much more efficient in the energy sector in general.
I mean, one thing one should probably not forget is even if you have hydrogen, it's based on electricity.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, basically we had just a scenario coming out, or a couple of scenarios for a carbon neutral economy. And they say most of them predict like the share of electricity in energy to be in 2050 about 70+%. I mean, if you compare that to the situation now, and the rest is basically also based on electricity.
Exactly.
So in that sense, I mean, I was just saying, like the international trade, like across oceans, etc. You won't see the electricity; you'll see the basically processed products then.
I would like to follow up from that a little bit before we move on to the next question from the audience. Karen, you've said that high fossil fuel prices are the best thing that can happen to the energy transition. I broadly agree, but I just want to challenge that a little bit in the sense that do you think that this could also help fuel a political backlash against or could it be leveraged as a political backlash against the energy transition? Do you see that happening or not so much? And what can we do about it? What do you think of the kind of paradox of, all of this discussion about, Russia holding back gas reserves or maybe not, or the US releasing stockpiles? Everyone's very worried about there not being enough gas. Well, at the same time, we're all talking about how we should move away from fossil fuels, which is all a bit odd. And the other question that I feel you've both perhaps touched upon a bit is the diversification of energy sources, and what do you see as the geopolitical implications of the energy transition? Because one of the co-benefits that has been highlighted, and perhaps is also part of the motivation, is reducing reliance on oil exporting countries that sometimes have governments that are accused of human rights violations, that act as a cartel and so on. But on the other hand, you could also say that we're now very dependent on China to supply us with solar panels and raw materials, perhaps that go into a lot of clean technologies. And also, there was an article, I think, in the Financial Times a few months ago about how some green jobs, because we've heard a lot about green jobs, are very dirty, and they involve like mining for cobalt in the DRC that has a lot of issues with child labor and so on. And some commentators are talking about a new resource curse emerging from these kinds of minerals. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that. I realize these are two questions, so feel free to answer on whichever aspect you want. Two.
Well, because it's like five. Perhaps I should start with the this one on the backlash or not of the hype. It's both. I mean, if you want to be honest, it's both. I mean, but the problem really is for if you conduct climate policy, if fossils are cheap, then people wouldn't want to change because everything else seems to be more expensive. If prices are high, they're afraid that prices might even go higher. So there is a certain backlash. And I mean, for example, you were able to observe that in German politics right now, because we have the new coalition agreement just came out. And basically the Greens and most parties always said before the election, we have to have higher carbon prices in the German emission trading system. So not the European, but the German one that we can control. And due to the high fossil fuel prices, they actually wrote, we won't do anything about it. So we'll leave it where it is. And I think that is really, really problematic if you actually let dictate your climate policy by fluctuations, short term probably, on oil markets, although that's a whole different matter and it's much more complicated than that. On that, Lucas, do you want to answer, or I can go on? I mean, I don't care.
Well, I had something on the global supply chain, but if you want to continue there with the carbon price.
I wanted to say also something on solar panels.
Yeah, please do. Yes, I can.
Yeah, I mean, basically with respect to solar panels, I think the dependency is not that concentrated, because there's also a number of big firms that are actually providing these panels. I mean, many are from China, that's for sure. But a good colleague of mine who's basically, especially into research of solar energy and stuff, what he told me I thought was really interesting, that actually by now the prices for panels and production costs in the solar industry have decreased so much that actually transport costs can be decisive. And so there is actually a point for trying to also build up again a European solar industry that would probably need some initial funding. But if what he says is correct, then that would be actually a sustainable industry after that. So I think some thought should be put into that, which industry you might want to at least also diversifying supply, want to also have at home. And with respect to dirty greens, I mean, that is a big problem. I mean, we have the supply chain laws, we have the taxonomy coming, but to a very large extent that only covers part. It's not necessarily mandatory. And we, in many cases, don't have the monitoring and verification system in place to actually see what is done in other countries, even though we might have supply chain laws for at least bigger companies. So I think there is still a lot to be done. And one thing one should also not really forget about the energy transition and about the great thing that fossil fuels will be phased out is that there's a lot of countries who will be hard hit by that. I mean, just saw numbers on Libya this morning. They have 95% of their export revenues stemming from fossil fuels, 70%, more than 70% of their state budgets stemming from fossil fuels. So I think part of if we talk about fairness, we cannot only talk about what's happening within our countries, but we also have to take care that nobody really not falls behind, but is completely left out there when we conduct this type of policy. But we have to try to also offer alternatives to these countries.
Yeah, very quickly, because you talked about the geopolitics. I mean, when we change from fossils to homemade electricity, say, or partly homemade, then of course the oil countries run into a big change, and they will have lots of stranded assets. Maybe we can also consider these countries as a whole as a stranded asset, and this is a big issue, of course. Now, Carl mentioned Libya, but we have Saudi Arabia, we have Russia even. So they really are, they have to see what they can do out of it. And they try, of course, they try to delay. This is their interest. But I think in general, we should also acknowledge that in the past, sadly, many of the conflicts and even wars were connected to natural resources and to oil, basically. So this probably, if we can overcome these things, there would also be an asset, because wars are really the worst thing. They destroy so much capital and even human lives. And I think these resource wars, that should be, I think it should diminish when we go out of oil. And then talk about the new minerals and all the new raw materials that we need. Yes, this is not without problem, and it's not everything is as clean as we think. And whenever Homo sapiens is walking around, we have some dirty impact, true. But again, if you talk about specific things like cobalt, I mean, there have been new technologies where you can actually avoid cobalt in batteries. You can do them differently, and we should give maximum incentives for companies to seek the best, the best product, and then also we try to influence countries to observe human rights. I mean, we never did it with the oil countries. I mean, if you look at women's rights and all this, I mean, nobody was talking too much about this. Now, when it comes to the DRC, of course, we are concerned, and we are rightfully so concerned. But we should be equally fair to our assessment of these countries, and of course, we try to have an impact on them, and we can have it on different levels. But I think we should seek for raw materials which are really not that scarce, which we can use a lot, which we can recycle. I think lithium will be a huge thing for recycling. This will come soon. And the only fact why we don't do it yet is that the old batteries, they last so long. So the big batteries in cars started 2012. They're still operational. So the recycling business will come, and it will be very efficient, but it's not yet so demanding, because the batteries and the raw material is not there. But it will be much cheaper to get new lithium out of old batteries than to go again to some sites. So I think this will all change the thing. And this recycling business, this will also be one of the very interesting dimensions of new development.
So you seem quite optimistic that cobalt and lithium are not going to be the new oil causing wars.
Well, if you follow development, I think one can be optimistic, but of course it's still there. So some people, if you have more cobalt in your battery, you can charge it faster. And if this is valued higher, then people want to have this one. But if you say, okay, I'm fine if my battery doesn't charge that fast, you can make it without cobalt or with much less cobalt. And there's also other cobalt side. It's not everything is not everything is from Congo. I think there's also sites in Australia and Canada, so you can also go in there.
Great, thank you. I think that's a really interesting debate. We have some more questions from the audience, and I think we only have 15 more minutes, so I'll move on to those now. Next question. Do you think emissions trading as used in the EU ETS and Kyoto Protocol could pave the path for energy transition where carbon taxes are unpopular?
I mean, from my side, I'm a big fan of carbon trading because I like I like especially the feature that basically you reach your goal automatically. I mean, you set a target, you set a linear reduction factor, and then you just go there. And prices basically adjust automatically to what you need. So I think that, but in my mind also, carbon taxes and emission trading are basically two sides of the same coin to a large extent. I mean, with economists, there has been a huge debate, or still is ongoing, carbon taxes, emission trading, advantages, disadvantages, but the development actually that we had before the German carbon pricing system was introduced was kind of interesting because suddenly economists did not bother anymore. I mean, main thing is we got a carbon price, whether it was a tax or whether it was an emission trading system in the end wasn't that important anymore. So I think that, yeah, I mean, sure, it's an alternative. You can also combine the features. I mean, you can, for example, introduce a minimum price like you have in the UK, like Germany wants to introduce now also for the current European emission trading system, because there's supposed to be a second one in the future. And so I think it's definitely an option, but you of course have to design it right. I mean, it was heavily criticized in the EU because the prices were so low. And now basically we have this kind of intertemporal incentives adjusted and suddenly prices are more or less going to the roof. A different thing or a more complex thing is carbon trading. If you look, for example, at the international carbon markets that the Paris Protocol, for example, a Paris Agreement is going to introduce now. I think that's a good thing on the one hand, because it can actually allow for more flexibility in reducing emissions. But on the other hand, the danger really is that that might come at the expense of actually developing technologies that you need, that might be delayed, because then you can basically just postpone doing that because you get cheap emission reductions from abroad. So that has to be designed really carefully in order not to diminish these incentives, and especially not keeping emitting and then just compensating through, for example, reforestation, which we will desperately need in a couple of decades in order to get us the negative emissions that we need to get to carbon neutrality.
Perfect. Nothing to add. I take the,
nothing to
next
add.
one.
Yeah. Okay.
Nothing to add here.
Great. So the next question is, well, very pressing. How is the pandemic going to accelerate or decelerate the energy transition?
Yeah, first, when it started, I think neither nor. So it's not helping, but it's not harming. So it's just transitional. I believe there are some impacts which are lasting, I guess. So, you know, this idea that we have a combined home office and an official office, this could be more and more relevant, and that we fly around less, that we have to do less business trips, and also scientists fly around a lot. So this could be a lasting impact. On the other hand, I think pandemic is not the best time to really change a lot, to have one wants to go back to normal as quickly as possible. Now, again, we are stranded. We cannot do it. So we are really disappointed in a sense. I believe we should, of course, just stick with the idea of having stringent climate policies. Pandemic alone will not solve it. If we do not change the mindset in general, pandemic is just a hit and it will go away afterwards, hopefully. But I think some structural impact will be lasting. And this is my hope, that it will help at least a little. And then we have just to continue with our carbon policies to make sure that it will be also a sustainable change and not only a transitory change.
I agree for the most part. I think the one area where it can be really delaying things is in countries which are low income. So basically, if they have a lot of debt accumulating now, no tax revenues, then things might actually postpone, and that's then also part of the task of the international community to actually help out. I mean, it might not delay things in Switzerland, might not delay things in the UK or in Germany, but not so sure about many countries that are even transitioning or developing countries.
Yeah, that's a very concerning aspect. Well, so this is probably going to be the last question, unless we're very quick, since we only have 8 more minutes. But from the room, international relations has been mentioned to impact the future of the energy transition. What other key factors should we be aware of that would imminently be affecting the energy transition? Very broad.
Yes, very broad. But one idea is that the quality of policy making. I mean, policies are key. And we learned now a little bit more about, we heard about the emission trading system, which has now improved a lot. Also about taxation, which are not easily implemented, would be a good instrument, but kind of. So I think the political economy thing is crucial. So we have recipes, we know how to do it, but we cannot bring the message across. So I think this is a key factor for me. Quality of policy designs. What do we propose to the policymakers? How can we sell them things which they like, which they want to implement? I had the idea to first send a check and then cash in later the money and these things, so that we really can go on with our work. So I think the quality of the policies is key for me. And then of course technology we already talked about. International relations is mentioned here in the chat, and then also everything which kind of brings people. I think Karen rightly talked about the behavioral aspects. I think there is also a tipping point where you probably think, okay, my big SUV, my fossil thing is no longer something which my neighbor admires me for, so I'm going to change. The same probably happens with eating meat and then becoming a vegetarian. I think this will also be one of the next things. So the meat industry, the milk industry, they will having the next tipping experiences. So these things will come, and probably they go much faster than we anticipate, because before the change is coming, we are not expecting it. We are kind of looking through a straw, think, well, the world is going as it is, and all of a sudden things change very rapidly. So, for example, in Norway, the private transport system has basically changed within 7 years only. So the electric cars had a very low share of new cars sold, and then they went up over 80% within 7 years. So this is very fast. And of course, the old cars are still around. Same will be for heating systems. It will change a lot, but still the old heating systems are there for a while. But then again, we could also consider after a while, when we have political majorities, and if we firmly on the path, then we should still accelerate a little bit. We could also, use political measures, democracy, to ban the last part if it's not fast enough. So it was said, if you invest now, these things will be around for 40 years. Yes. Technically, yes, but economically, if you really, if you hit them hard, you can make them go out faster, so they will have more stranded assets. And if you threaten them already now to have this kind of a risk of stranding, then of course they will also probably decide differently at the moment. Last thing, I think finance. We did not really talk about climate finance. I think behind every investment decision is somebody who gives the money for the investment. And we have big finance institutions, we have big national banks, we have big commercial banks, we have brokers, bankers. They need to, and also in the banking sector, the learning was very slow at the beginning. They were just more laughing and say, well, these are the Greens and these are those who want to improve the world, but we are the bankers. And now they believe this is a good business model, and they can also make more money with it. And this is actually interesting for them, so because they can charge higher fees on sustainable funds and whatever. So this is something which then comes on top. I think with finance also, we learned only recently how effective it is, and then the transition can go faster. So the finance view of the whole thing needs also be stressed here.
Nothing to add.
Nothing to add.
The one thing that I think is really key is not losing the population. That sounds weird because you're part of it. But I had the feeling that for a long time, climate policy and changing your behavior was considered something like well-off people did, and it was not really requirement. It was kind of voluntary. And now this kind of attitude towards, oh, it's all nice and it's fun and we won't change much. I think that's biting us in the because now we suddenly discovered that there will be changes necessary in our behavior, like Lucas said, with respect to perhaps food, with respect to living, with respect to transport. And I think we need a good measure of transparency about that there will be change, but also about the good sides that they're going to come. So it's a mixed bag. I mean, at least in the transition, like you said, it's about the transition. If we had a green field where we could just start afresh, then we wouldn't have many of our problems. But we have to get over that hump. And I think to really keep people, keep voters especially, positive with respect to that change, I think that will be key, because then all the policies can be designed, policies can be implemented.
Great, thank you. I think we've had perfect timekeeping. We have 2 more minutes. So if you have any very quick final thoughts, or perhaps any advice for students who want to go into working on the energy transition, like anything that can be said in 20 seconds?
Well, I hope that many are interested in the topic and well, try to do research in this. We need it. We need you. Please help us. So yeah, if not for the young people, how should we? I think our generation has to solve the problem, but the young have to really inspire us, and they already did with the protests. But now, if you do a concept, well, a basic contribution, that would be highly welcome, and in any respect, of course.
And if you don't want to stay in academia, which is completely fine, then there's a lot of intelligent people needed in think tanks and ministries. So there's a lot still to be done. And I think the more bright people we get, the better.
Wonderful. Yeah, on that very positive note, thank you very much for being here and talking to us about this really important topic. I think it's been a great discussion. I've enjoyed it a lot. And yeah, thanks so much for organizing this panel.
Especially thank you very much, Pia, for coming and moderating this panel and asking very good questions. And also Karen and Lucas, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It was a fantastic way to end our symposium as well. This was the last event, the symposium. Thank you very much for everyone coming to listen, and I hope to see everyone in future events as well. Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Have a good evening and stay healthy.
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.